Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Philly podcast. I'm once again joined by Florian. Happy to have you here tonight, Florian. And continuing with our, arc of the intersection of spirituality and faith on the one hand and science on the other, I thought it would be interesting for him and I to pre-watch an interesting documentary, if you will, between Doug Wilson, a conservative pastor from Idaho, and Christopher Hitchens, which occurred in 2009, which was called Collision. Now, it seems to have clips from various interviews and documentaries already. They started back in 2007, God is Not Great, a sort of back and forth with blogging, call and response. And then that just became this big mashup. Now, the reason why I think this was important is I believe that a lot of Christians at the time played a little bit too soft with someone like Hitchens. Someone like Hitchens is known for being brash, rhetorical, not really making syllogistic arguments. And a lot of times he was just kind of allowed to get away with it. Okay, fine. But it was nice to see a pastor or a Christian intellectual who stood up and said, hey, whoa, no, we're not going to back down here. So I thought that would be kind of interesting to look at that. Now, I saw this before many years ago, but since this is like now 16 years old and the New Atheist movement's all gone, and in fact, we're going to talk about the New Atheist movement this weekend, Florian, Keith, and I, and its impact on the country, I think that this will be kind of an interesting discussion. So I think we'll open up with this, Florian. What are some of your thoughts and takeaways from the debate? How do you think Hitchens performed? How do you think Doug Wilson performed? What did you think of what they had to say?
Well, Hitchens was humbled in many cases. Sometimes, sometimes Doug Wilson says something, makes a really good argument, and you see Hitchens sitting there with a stone face, and you kind of know right now he is really like he either has to admit that was a good argument, or he's kind of getting mildly annoyed. But he all takes it in good spirit. What I found very interesting is, and what I actually liked, sometimes you have articles or videos that bury the lead, right? So that kind of like ease you into it and then work towards a conclusion. But this here starts right away with Wilson saying that Christianity is rational, beautiful, and good. So you see him in the lecture, and he has these things: rational, beautiful, and good. The ancient triad of truth, godness, and beauty, objective standards, right? So tell people that beauty is objective, for example. That gets most people angry nowadays. But I believe it's true. Objective standards, Christians are not rationalists, and rationalists aren't even rationalists. That's what Wilson says in the beginning, because every position is a faith position, and that is true if you think about like songs like Imagine, right? It's like they even had like this John Lennon song. They had it either during COVID or during the first Trump term. Some left-wing actors came together and basically espoused the values of that song. But when I talked to my father, who is a reverend, earlier, like years ago, he said he didn't like that song Imagine, even though he liked the Beatles, but he didn't like that song because, well, if you imagine there's no heaven and no hell or anything, you do believe in something else. Humans always believe in something, right? And that aligns with every position is a faith position. I like the entry into the documentary a lot, and then one good example of where Wilson doesn't let Hitchens get away with an argument is when Hitchens says Christianity is immoral because it involves scapegoating someone else for your sins, right? Jesus died for your sins. It's scapegoating someone else, and it's also a totalitarian system that pursues thought crime and punishes you with eternal condemnation. That's a very, very, very clear. I think that's like what you can boil down majority of Hitchens' arguments to. And then Wilson says, well, Christopher says these things are all immoral, but by whose standard? What is the overarching philosophy here? And why would that worldview be in charge of Christianity here? But even Hitchens uses that Christian ethical standard to criticize Christianity. Like he okay, let me climb into this Christian car and drive it against a tree. And I found that was very poignant and very good. he doesn't have any car to drive on his own, right? And so substitutionary atonement is immoral, but who says, right? And then that's really interesting. Then Hitchens goes on and says that's mildly insulting to claim that without Christianity we wouldn't know right from wrong. Knowing right from wrong is innate in human beings. Why would the Jewish tribes need to be told at Mount Sinai that murder and theft was wrong? Of course, they knew that by themselves. But then I thought, did they really? I mean, you can look at many regimes nowadays where people find it completely okay to steal and murder, right? And then also, if we don't just look at the totalitarian systems like fascism, National Socialism, communism, all that kind of stuff, all kind of movements. But then my father also told me about Jewish fables by some rabbi called Nachman, and I may have gotten it wrong. But one thing I always impressed me was if you look at Rabbi Nachman's works, he basically has several examples of a society, and he says you can even imagine a society that finds it completely okay to steal and murder. Or I mean, look at murder. There can be a society where the murderer is the king. Why? Because he brings people to heaven much earlier, right? Isn't that the desirable end goal, to get to heaven? Or he gets the evildoer into hell already. That's good. Well, he gets them disposed of quickly, and so they get put to their end goal very quickly. And so you can even find moral arguments for murdering and for behaving really in an immoral way. You can find arguments that is justified. And so that has been an example for many societies in history, right? So knowing right from wrong is not innate in human beings. It can be subverted, right? And I think that's the most important point here. We need Christianity as a common, or Christianity provides a common overarching feeling, worldview on which we base our actions, right? Everything else, we talked about that earlier, I mentioned that in between, is like nowadays, if you talk to atheists, they kind of have a worldview of preference, right? They don't like people doing bad things to one another. That's why they say morality is innate in people. But you know, those people, especially the left wingers in the U.S., don't have any problem destroying others. Like, look at the vandalism against Tesla, for example, or against people they don't like. They find it completely moral to screw with people they don't like, right? So morality is not innate, right? And so I think that's an important part we need to realize.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack here. I appreciate your thoughts, Florian. The thing here that I want to say is, let's look at the New Atheist position first and Christopher Hitchens. The thing that the New Atheist would say again and again and again, and Christopher Hitchens more or less says in this documentary, is that atheism is a lack of belief. It doesn't need to have any, it'd be about anything. But now this was 2009, right? Now we know this is false because in 2012 we had Atheism Plus, which is basically the beginning of the woke in the modern U.S. political discourse, with the rise of, well, it was immediately preceded by Elevator Gate, where Rebecca Watson claimed that there was misogyny in atheism conferences. And so now you have Atheism Plus, which says, now we're going to be progressive. We're going to have all these positive goals, anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia, I guess, and other things. And that led to a huge schism amongst the New Atheists. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on Saturday when we talk about the New Atheists, but that is just false. It's just empirically false. And this was like the high watermark before the split. 2009, 2010 was kind of this high watermark of smug complacency. And Hitchens just kind of drips with it. This is, of course, right before the big fissure. Now, I think Hitchens lived to see this. I think he died of cancer or something, but I don't remember what his comments were on Atheism Plus. Now, Dawkins was very opposed to it. In fact, it started out with an attack on Dawkins. So, he was, of course, very opposed to this. But the other thing is, there's a sense in which Christopher Hitchens is very mealy-mouthed, because I don't know if he's intentionally misunderstanding Doug Wilson or if he's just really not that intelligent. Because there's multiple points in the documentary where Doug Wilson says, I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. I'm not saying atheists don't know right from wrong. I'm saying that atheists can't give an account. There's the one time you mentioned at the lecture hall, but then there's that time when they're in the car together and he talks about the 4 different people, the happy atheist, the grumpy atheist, the happy Christian, and the grumpy Christian. He says the same thing there. And I think there's a third place, which I forget. Now, again, I don't know if Christopher Hitchens was being willfully ignorant or just wasn't very smart, but it doesn't seem to be a very complex issue. Now I'm going to double down on this here too, because the question of moral realism, right, the idea of justifying moral statements, was first leveled against atheists by atheists. So Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols says you can't have Christian morality and reject the Bible because it's not self-evident at all. So he actually would disagree with Hitchens. It's not self-evident at all that you should love your neighbor and take care of the sick and all that stuff. And Max Stirner in The Ego on His Own also says this. So it needs to be remembered that the first people who criticized the large group of atheist intellectuals for not being serious and not having a justification for morality are fellow atheists. The only riddle here is why Christians don't bring this up more, because Hitchens wants to argue that this is a Christian objection. It's not. Nietzsche wasn't a Christian, neither was Max Stirner. They were arguing that these the new atheists didn't exist, but the liberal atheists, the socialist atheists, they were humanitarian, they were Christian light, and they couldn't give a justification for themselves. So there's that. There's a sense in which Hitchens is a lot more conceited than Doug, because he talks a lot about his own work, his own writing, people meeting him on the street saying, "Oh, hey, Hitchens, I love your work." Whereas Doug Wilson doesn't come off as saying that. He's more just, I have an argument to make. Let's see the argument, the product being sold was Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was the product being sold. He was the argument. Whether or not he convinced people to be an atheist or not is immaterial, because he says at the end, that one dinner he had with Dawkins, I wouldn't convert the last believer. I would just keep that person around. So it really kind of smells. I mean, obviously both sides made a lot of money. Obviously there's some marketing involved, but unlike Doug, Christopher just doesn't have an argument. And I think probably the best example of Christopher not having an argument was at the very end when they're at that, I guess, a bar or a pub, where he says, if you saw a pregnant woman on the ground getting kicked in the stomach, would you find that morally objectionable? And then Doug Wilson says, well, no, your side would say you're doing it the wrong way. You got to go down to Planned Parenthood. and then Hitchens was like, well, that's not fair. And it's like, well, no, actually, it's totally fair, because what you're doing is you're grandstanding. You're not making an argument. See, what Hitchens does, and this is actually was effective at the time, was he was appealing to a zeitgeist, to an already existing consensus within the American educated liberal elite. And, the Simpson Americans, the whatever. And it's like, so look at this crazy person over here who disagrees with the mainstream. But the problem was that was all based on an assumption that culture was frozen and that we wouldn't splinter like we actually did just 3 years later within the atheist movement itself with Elevator Gate. So that's my thoughts on Hitchens. Now, Doug, what needs to be said about Doug is that for those who aren't aware of the Christian context here, within homeschooling and conservative evangelical Christianity, specifically the Reformed Christianity, there was an effort towards what was called worldview building. The idea that Christians needed to have a sort of rational approach to demonstrating their beliefs to other people, saying, hey, what you need, we have reasons for believing these things, but then also calling out the fact that secular people had faith-based assumptions. And this is part of a more narrow group of apologetics, which is called presuppositional apologetics, which is traced to a Dutch Reformed thinker named Van Til, who basically is arguing that, in a nutshell, for rational logical thought to be true, we have to make certain assumptions. And the only set of assumptions that guarantees logical reasoning is those based on a Christian worldview. And Doug Wilson is a descendant of that long history that goes back to the 50s and 60s. And so that wasn't necessarily made clear in the documentary, but that's what Doug Wilson is the sort of end result of. So a lot of his style is not to defend a given Christian doctrine, but to say that, well, two things. One, the atheist has no grounds on which to say this or that moral injunction is bad, nor does the atheist have any rational grounds for his own moral beliefs. And in that regard, Doug Wilson stuck to the script, right? He didn't let Christopher Hitchens pull him around. That's, again, one of the reasons why I thought this was a good documentary, is that he doesn't let him do that. One thing that I might have docked Doug points for is he didn't bring up that the rational justification argument doesn't go back to Christians. It actually begins with atheists. Nietzsche is a household name. Max Stirner, not quite so much. But atheists really need to be confronted with these individuals who point out you can't just blithely assume certain aspects of Christian morality and not be a Christian. That's a real problem they have to deal with, and they haven't really dealt with it. The other thing I would have liked, now Doug does deal with it though, but the whole Amalekite angle. What about the Amalekites? Well, I mean, what about Planned Parenthood? I mean, it's the same thing, right? If you're gonna grandstand about the ancient Hebrews killing children, what about you guys killing children? I wish Doug he brought it up once at the end, but I wish he brought it up more, because all too often, people like Hitchens got away with that. And I would say, as an overall rating, Doug Wilson, I think, won. And that's sort of my brief summary of both of their performances. Back to you, Florian.
Well, I think what's also interesting is, and I remember that I read somebody made a point on Twitter. If you look at the Amalekites and Planned Parenthood, if we lump them together, which we certainly can do, there is an observation that every society that practices infanticide, and abortion is just a time-shifted infanticide, right? It really depends on the morals that you give yourself, a society, what is still worthy life, right? You could imagine somebody who says, a society who says, like, birth itself is not I mean, the child must make it to 3 years to be considered a person. That's of course dreadful, but it's not that far away from what people could do when they allow abortion. Now, every society that did infanticide and would destroy the unworthy children or the weak children, would just put them outside and wait when they survive. They some of them didn't survive, and so that was then deemed okay. Those societies always declined over time, right? So you can make the point that actually Christian morality is successful in the end, because it is connected to the survival of societies. Because without Christian morality, your society will just vanish, right? And I think that's a correction I would like to make to some people that say evolution can't be true because that would be God just rolling the dice. It's not that, because evolution is not completely something that is based on complete randomness. Now, it's more like we're locking in the mutations that work and then develop further on the base of that. Because there was a debate one point where they touch on evolution, which so what Hitchens says, for example, that without science you will only know what you need to know. Okay, so that means if you believe there's a God and you don't have developed a scientific method, you see the stars and you need them to navigate, so you come up with an explanation for the stars, and you don't venture further. You don't ask whether there's further stars in the universe, and you just claim God has put the stars there to help you navigate, but you don't know what else is out there yet. He does the same, right? Or many people that are scientifically minded do the same, because they believe in evolutionary psychology. That's basically the same what he describes, because we say we only evolve to weather the environment the way we need to survive, right? We only develop the eyes that help us detect food and enemies, and that's how we make our way through the world. Evolutionary psychology. But that's not true. I mean, that's a scientific view, And that's not really too far removed from saying that, oh, okay, if you don't believe in God, you don't see any further truth. Yeah, but neither would you when you believe in evolutionary psychology. Yet what I find really interesting is there are people who create art and music, and they do it for what purpose? There's no clear immediate purpose. There's no clear immediate survival bias. Even if you start a business, right? If you just do the business to chase after money, that business will not survive beyond the first or second year mark, because you can't just build something just on the immediate pursuit of resources. You need to have something. You have to have a longer time horizon. And there's some people who really love money, and that's all they really love, and so they love to make more money. Um, sure, but these are the exceptions. And most people cannot have a business when they just look at momentary fulfillment of resources. Look at Elon Musk. He doesn't need to handle 10 companies or how many he has and is still handling. He has enough to live. This is basically he has secured his resources. He has secured his survival. The survival of his entire DNA is well documented, now spread into the entire world. I think he has done enough, and yet he's still going at it. Why do some people still go at it? If all we do is just obeying evolution and just trying to maximize resources, that doesn't make any sense unless you have a belief in something, some higher principles that you want to obey, subconsciously or consciously.
Well, yeah, and so one of the things that Christopher Hitchens points to, the clip is at the end, whether at the bar, the pub, or whatever. Again, and he says that some of the effect, what moral thing could a Christian do that an atheist couldn't? Now, that's again where Doug has to say, I'm not saying atheists can't do good things, but they can't justify it. That's the third time. But here's the real distinction that I wish Doug had made, and that is, if you go back in time, there are certain ideas that just could not be comprehended because enough time and human thought hadn't passed yet. So prior to the 4th century, we don't have hospitals. That was invented by the Christians. Prior to the 11th century, we don't have universities. That was invented by the Christians. So the idea that, like, what Christopher Hitchens is saying is that, absent Christianity, some sort of naturalistic process working within humanity around the world would develop these institutions. The question, though, is outside of the Christian world, they were not developed independently. So the question is why? And of course, the atheists don't have an answer for this. And furthermore, if you can point to a secular society or an atheistic society that has all of these things, it has all of these things because it got it first from a Christian society. So, think of like secular countries in Europe. They were Christian 200 years ago. So where do these things come from? Well, they came from the Christians. And so, that's a big element that, wasn't, the atheists have never actually dealt with, right? They never actually dealt with that. And so when we look at the performance, the other thing too is one of the rhetorical devices of Christopher Hitchens, which is frustrating, is he likes to use a lot of verbiage to paint word pictures. So there's one part where he says, well, let's just look through a telescope and look at the black hole or the stars and look how beautiful they are. And how could anything in your religious book be as beautiful as that? And it's like, well, what's beauty? Like, why are we using that as an adjective to describe what we see through the Hubble Space Telescope? I mean, this is the entire point of what Doug Wilson was getting at. What are these? Because remember, what was Dawkins constantly pilloried for saying? He said, I'm paraphrasing, but one of his books, he said that if we look at the universe, we see what we expect to see, one of blind, pitiless indifference, where things like murder and sexual assault and all of these things don't matter because at the rock bottom, the universe doesn't care and it's meaningless. Right. So why do you care? There's actually one revealing point where somebody asked Christopher Hitchens at the end, if at the end, we all die in the heat death of the universe and there's no afterlife and there's no meaning to this life, what is actually the point of justice? And Hitchens says, well, it's just because I like to do it. Well, okay, but Stalin doesn't like to do it. So where are we at now?
Yeah, that's a good point. I also find like whenever atheists don't explain anything or don't know how to explain it, they just put an error term in the equations, and that's basically it. And they don't provide any further explanation for why something would be the way. Um, and that's a good point. If the universe doesn't care, why do you care, right? And I think that's the only explanation to me could be that there is some divine force or something that is outside our abilities to explain. There's something that wants us to look at truth. And at the very beginning, something else that Pastor Wilson also said was that, okay, we don't know everything about the universe, but we certainly know, even if you're a scientist and don't believe in God, we certainly know what how what the methods are to get at the truth, right? So we know that we know how to look for truth, and this is really something that you can't dispute. And even an atheist would have to tell you, I know that that's the way. The scientific method is the way to discern truth, to find out truth. I have a way to figure out truth for myself, right? But how do they know? How do you know? How do you know what the way is to? How do you know where tools come from? And I find that's a very good perspective, because otherwise we're talking about Bible versus reality, and you can't prove what's in the Bible. Ha ha ha. No, but that's not the point. I mean, your tools that you use, right? They are coming from somewhere. Where are they coming from?
Yes, and there's another during one of the clips where they're being interviewed uh on like that podium, and oh yeah, it was some Christian media outlet. And then Christopher Hitchens says, I'm in the constant search for truth. And they make that analogy about Chesterton and a mouth being open to bite down on the facts. And then he says, but we can never actually know that we got there. Well, I mean, that's a really mealy mouthed answer, because let's say you're talking to an engineer and you ask an engineer to develop some sort of new synthetic material for, say, space use. But then you told the engineer, but you know what? We can never actually know if you've built the thing that we're looking for. Well, he would just say, screw off, and wouldn't take your job. He'd say, I'm going to work for someone else. So, right, we don't know what it looks like yet, right? Because we have this ideal in our head of the kind of synthetic material we want to create, but it hasn't been created yet. And so, but we have a concrete definition that if the engineer could create it, he'd get paid, and then he'd be the chief designer. Now, if we view that's how he views truth. But this is just mealy mouth. Nobody would do this in a market for a product if he knew that the potential employer would just say, well, we don't actually ever know if you submit a blueprint or a plan or a schema that could actually produce this synthetic material. He'd be like, well, I'm not going to work for you, because how would I ever, but nobody actually acts like this, right? It only in this one area did he act like this. And it's like, well, this is where I'm going to make a bold claim, and I'll repeat this on the weekend. I don't think that these new atheist people actually held these positions. I think they were put up to it. And why do I think this? Well, first of all, they pivoted real freaking fast. Look at how fast Dawkins pivoted. I'm a cultural Christian now. We got to fight Muslims. What? That's not the Dawkins I remember from 2005. Okay. And then furthermore, who just, let's use Eroy analogies, right? If this is how Hitchens views a pursuit for truth, he's dumping a lot of energy into something that he never will actually get, which means it's an energy sink, which means it's not actually going to work. He's going to have to get energy from outside of this process in order for him to keep looking for truth, which he's never going to get. And so that to me looks more like a gimmick, because it's like, well, there's no payoff. There's no result. I don't mean in terms of money. I mean in terms of little energy exchange. You're just emoting out into the void, converting your your energy into your matter into energy, and then you don't get it back. It's like, well, why? Why are you doing this? I mean, maybe you're just, trying to cool down the human machine, but I think a lot of this is go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two. If you think about it, that means there are two groups of atheists, right? They are either grifters or leaves in the wind in search of consensus, right? So basically, most people like Dawkins, and I don't want to say Hitchens, but others that change their worldview on a dime. That sounds like very much like what a grifter does. So deep at his heart, Dawkins probably was at least happy that he got some successful money and status. He could travel around, be the biggest atheist there. So he probably felt like a king. He liked that, right? So basically, that was his motivation, and now he sees that his audience is vanishing, so he tries to pivot to keep them somewhat, right? But if you talk to people who just don't believe in God, they are often like leaves in the wind in search of consensus. With that, I mean, they try to do what is the most beneficial thing for everyone, but they don't adhere to an independent morality. In fact, someone who is an atheist will very unlikely be like, how you should call it, like a martyr in that, with just withstanding whatever arguments are thrown at him, and just let society kill him and stand up for atheism. I don't think that happened, or maybe it happens, but very sparingly. Most people will just change their view, and we know it from people that we discussed with. Many of us probably know it, that those people have changed their tunes ever so subtly. They basically now espouse the same branding that society has on certain things, that a completely different branding if society tomorrow decides, which I guess would be a good thing, maybe.
Well,
but if society decides all of a sudden that we need to have more religion in our lives, those people would also just have more religion in their life, right? They just try to fit in. And religious people will be the ones who are saying, I have my set of morals, and here I stand, and I can't do no further.
Well, I mean, a good example of what you're saying is the bugbear issue of genital mutilation. At that time, Islamic circumcision of women was all, I mean, Christopher Hitchens was all about that.
Yeah.
And then here comes the transgender movement, and W2F, I love genital mutilation now, from exactly the same people that were all hot and bothered a decade earlier. It's like, well, all right, we know what's going on here. This is not a principled position. This is just somebody, who's trends chasing. But I think it's important to double back on the fact that the purported unity that of popular opinion that someone like Hitchens very deftly played into is shattered into a million pieces now. And the atheist movement itself dissolved shortly after, as a unified front, shortly after this in 2012 with Atheism Plus. There were prominent atheist YouTubers that just had serious, YouTube wars, video wars over this without going into the details. And so the kind of optimism. No, see, this is interesting. I actually think Hitchens did believe what he said. I think people like Dawkins and Sam Harris, and who was the fourth guy? I always forget his name.
Dawkins, Sam Harris, the four horses of apocalypse, as they were sometimes called. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Christopher Dawkins, and
I don't remember his name, but you know who I mean, though, Florian, the fourth guy. I think a lot of these guys didn't actually believe it. I think Christopher Hitchens did, though. And the reason why I think he did was right up until his death, there were people pressuring him to change some of his less popular opinions, and he didn't change them. So to me, that's a sign that Hitchens either had a lot of FU money, or he probably did, but he also probably had his own set of principles, whatever those were. And so I'm willing to give him a little bit more credit. But nonetheless, it was an unwarranted optimism that has since fallen apart. And the interesting thing, too, is after the video, Christopher Hitchens had this to say about his whole experience. He says, "However, I have discovered that the so-called Christian right is much less monolithic and very much more polite and hospitable than I would once have thought, or than most liberals believe." Which, see, this is actually, I think, another reason why Doug Wilson and his affiliates supported Collision, was not only did they want to have a showdown with Christopher Hitchens, which obviously is going to be cool and get a lot of attention, but also to show one of the leading new atheists and liberal advocates of the country that the propaganda and the rhetoric about them was false. And I think in that regard as well, Collision was successful because Hitchens, he said it. He said it. So yeah.
I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to. By the way, I said the four horses of apocalypse was the four horsemen. I think Daniel Dennett was the fourth one.
Yes, he
Uh,
was.
and I don't want to. I don't want to do bad. I don't want to. I don't want to say something bad about an atheist. Maybe there was someone who was standing firm to his principles and was killed for that. I certainly don't want to. Don't want to denigrate that. But I think if you want to, if we go that extreme, if we want to go, if you want to go get martyred, you better have a very, very solid moral foundation for what you do, and not just like, okay, they can kill me now. I want to have always consensus with that. What is with having a nice society? That's not enough for really standing up for yourself, right? So it all comes down to that. Yeah, I mean, Christianity does provide you a stronger moral foundation. And as Wilson said in the beginning, there's objective truth, objective beauty, and objective logic. I think those are the 3 points he brought. And you can't get that with just some convenience atheism, which is not even thought through. I mean, most atheists get their ideas from TV shows, right? Yeah, that's true. That was a funny episode with Homer Simpson. Yeah, it was a funny episode with Homer Simpson, but I appreciate the show like anyone else. But you shouldn't take your morality from that.
Right. I thought this was very interesting. There was a scene in the film where Christopher Hitchens is in the car talking about growing up. Now, he said that his parents did not raise him in the faith, but that he was obligated to go to a church to read the Bible because of the Anglican Church, and it was a part of his education upbringing, and he viewed that with resentment as compulsion. Well, I'm like, well, hold up. What about compulsory education in general? Isn't this really an argument against compulsory education in general, not just the compulsory education within the Anglican Church? And that's where a lot of the atheists are not convincing, because it's like, well, yeah, okay, but like there's a whole lot of other compulsory things the government does to you that are really unpleasant and people don't like. Why is it this thing that you're targeting and not the others? And partly it's because I think atheists but more in general, scientists have this prevalence for authoritarian structures because, as Jacques Ellul says, technique seeks to have a global interlocking system of connection. And so a global integrated system of technology, if that's how technique is moving, is what scientists would want, because that's what they're pushing for. Now, he wasn't a scientist. Dawkins was. Harris, I think, was, right? And then Dennett was a philosopher.
I think, yeah, I'm not sure what scientist Harris was. Harris also grew up with trust fund money. I think his parents or some close relatives were producers of Golden Girls. So he basically, Sam Harris is basically a dandy without the flamboyance.
But the point is, though, Dawkins opposed Brexit because he thought the EU was good. And it's interesting that someone like the new atheists are more than okay with intrusive, coercive government, except in this one place. And I'm like, well, isn't that awfully contrived?
Well, what comes to my mind also is, and I read another book in Germany written by someone who is who was growing up in a Protestant household. I grew up in a Protestant house. My father is a reverend. And in Germany, at least, you have these, we are always told, or, one thing that the Protestant church kind of wants their reverends to do, or like every reverend does, is every Sunday morning you read there's a small book called the slogans, Losungen, it's in German. It's basically a book of slogans, like little Bible quotes, and you're supposed to read that every morning. In Germany, you also need to know the Protestant church. They have a certain schedule. Like, a reverend can't just decide on his own what he preaches. this Sunday there's a certain schedule that the overarching Protestant church, that the church administration gives out. And then every Sunday you would read to your family of the like a slogan from the Bible, and those slogans were kind of depressing sometimes, as Bible slogans can be if you don't know the context, and it's a very strange way to transmit Christian thought. But this is the Protestant way. There's like very little brimborium around it, right? There's very little pictures, there's very little images, there's very little room for beauty and art. It's everything is very stripped down, bare bones, and it can be depressing to grow up with that. And so, in a way, that is, in a way, some kind of compulsory education that people resent after a while because there's nothing uplifting there. The same that the wokists have. The wokists don't have any redemption in there, right? There's like you have to behave a certain way, and if you don't, well, too bad for you. You're going to hell, to the woke hell, without ever any chance of getting out. And it fits. I'm just getting this thought of mine. It fits with Keith's theory that wokeism comes from Protestantism, or that they have at least a very common origin or something like that. And so compulsory education, as you said, the secular people also have that, and you can resent it the same way. And I remember this scene in the car when Hitchens said that his father grew up in a very strict religious dogmatic household, and he didn't want that for his kids. And so he basically was a silent rebellion against that, right? But you have that for every point, right? It's maybe it's a bit unfortunate that atheists always point out that the Bible doesn't give them anything uplifting, and that's why they left it by the wayside. But that doesn't mean that Christianity as such is wicked or shouldn't be pursued.
Yeah, and I guess the other element too is that this debate was, again, as much as it was, the clash of atheism versus Christianity, it was these two personalities. And one of the things that I think sets Doug Wilson apart from some of the other Christians that Christopher Hitchens debated was he also leans into that personality angle. He has that personality he leans into. He's been doing that, I think, more lately as well in order to grow his influence. But you get the impression that you're dealing with two equals, right? Because normally Hitchens tries to bulldoze people. And he wasn't really able to bulldoze, the guy, right? So Doug Wilson wasn't really bulldozed by Hitchens. And he talks about his own upbringing, his own, faith. And the other thing too is, let's bring in the Nietzschean angle, right? I mean, most of Hitchens' motivation is this, resentment. It's like, this is not, this is, I had to learn about, the church in school because of the Anglicans, or this or that in my life, right? And it's like, well, again, Nietzsche would criticize that as a kind of slave morality. He would also criticize Doug Wilson as a form of slave morality, obviously. But the thing is, the new atheist like Christopher Hitchens didn't really escape that, right? And the other thing you can notice is that Doug Wilson is not as much, if at all, motivated by resentment, which I think is an interesting character comparison, right? And also, while in a sense they both are crusaders and they have a message to get out, the message of Hitchens is almost entirely negative. It's, get rid of the people that I call bad, right? Which are religious people. And Doug Wilson has more of a constructive vision, right? He has now, the point of the debate and the interview wasn't to have Doug Wilson construct his ideal society, but you could tell that he was coming from a place where he does have a positive vision.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, we can hear you, Florian.
Okay. Yeah, I think also in this vein, you can also look at the at the very beginning of the documentary, they showed the picture of Wilson with his family, and I think he has like a large family. And I thought to myself when I saw that picture that that's something atheists would sneer about, like, haha, look at these idiots with like 6 children, or look how they're walking around, like this makes people extremely uncomfortable if they see a family with 6 children, or like, I mean, I think Wilson had 6 or 7 or 5, a lot of children,
So
right?
just real quick, Florian, for the record, those are probably his grandchildren. He only has 3 children.
Oh, okay.
Not that you'd know that, but those were probably his grandchildren.
But yeah, it still works, right? It's a large family. They sit together and then they pray and together and they sing songs together. And I think many atheists they see that and they can't fathom that someone can be happy like that, and they think those guys must be somehow nuts. And that's exactly how they are described by the media. Short aside, one additional thing that the Obama administration did very badly was there was a religious family that was in Germany, and they were not allowed to homeschool their children. So they basically went to the U.S. and wanted to have asylum, and they were denied by the Obama administration, right? So don't tell me, let not anyone tell me that the atheists or like all the nice fancy leftists are not like also pulling favorites when it comes to being everyone's friend. That's all bogus. That's all for show. And it feeds back what I said about atheists. Most atheists that come from that background, they are either grifters or in search of consensus. But yeah, maybe we should ask ourselves why is the view on families like that? Why are families like that by atheists or by the state viewed as untrustworthy? Why would people badmouth them? Why would people get uncomfortable looking at large families? I think that's a very interesting point. And if you are traumatized by by people telling you the Bible slogans at breakfast, well, maybe you would be much better in a family that is happy and sings together. It seems to be a much more positive view on life. Then it's not one of resentment. It's one of uplifting, and that's probably where Wilson also got his mindset from. It's not resentment, because if you grow up and you say, I don't want to have anything to do with church because they are compulsory educating someone, they're basically forcing their will on others. You don't have you still have a curse on your life philosophy in a way, because you think because it's born out of negativity, out of resentment. You resent something, rather you're going away from something rather than moving towards something. Which is also another example. They brought somebody. I don't remember precisely, but they had this example of someone in at the bus sitting next to you and saying I like being a prophet, or saying I know everything, and people would back away from them. Why though? Why? Because you live by resentment, not by building up something positive.
But in fact, they actually don't. Think of like someone like David Koresh, or someone like Manson. People actually follow that. So see, part of the problem is it doesn't even make sense rhetorically, because if you can fake it well enough, or at least convince others that you believe it enough, you may not be faking necessarily, you will get some followers. So I mean, part of this is just a kind of conceit that he has. It's like, well, actually, no, some people might actually, get followers that way. And then the other thing is, Hitchens is just missing the argument, right? He keeps on, he's in that same section. He says, just because you rose from the dead doesn't mean what you have to say is true. Well, that depends on what you have to say. I mean, for example, if in the Christian narrative, if you were alive at the time and you saw it happen, and Jesus Christ said he was the Son of God, and you prove it by rising from the dead, and then he does, you're not going to tell me seeing him after the resurrection doesn't mean anything to you. Of course it's going to mean something. And it's just disingenuous for Hitchens to say that, because we all know if he had been there to actually see that, and all of the incoming sense data to his eyes and his ears were that, oh yeah, it would mean something. I mean, he may not believe it, maybe. I mean, the Pharisees didn't, but the fact is, it would, he wouldn't be that glib about it if he were there to see it.
Well, also there's an important thing that Hitchens talked about. Well, the New Testament has all kinds of cases of people being resurrected, like Lazarus, for example. Some others that I forgot. but he talked about some other example, and then Jesus. But the difference between Lazarus and Jesus is that Lazarus died again of a natural death eventually, right? And Jesus did not. So
Yes.
that's a big distinction. And Hitchens made a weird point by saying that the Bible looks at a society where everyone kind of like, or where rising up from the dead was normal. Nah, I don't think it was that. I think it was maybe a society that where everyone, if you are mortally ill and then you make a recovery, then people also say this miraculous, right? That's basically like coming back from the dead. So maybe that's what that meant.
Well, so to briefly clarify that whole point, Doug Wilson says that those were resuscitations, right? You come back to life, but then you die again. And
Yep.
It wasn't like this was a regular occurrence. It was just something that people believed could happen on rare occasions.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're about at the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to say to sort of sum up your opinion of the interview or the discussion that we watched?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is there some. It's not just like atheism against religion. It is resentment against building something positive and walking towards something and walking away from something. And you're right. There are people who follow resentment in a way, right? There are people who are motivated with leaving something rather than moving towards something. But I think in the end you are much happier and your life makes much more sense if you move towards something eventually. And also, what one of the most interesting points from that documentary was what I said at the beginning. Basically, that you say there's objective, that the religion gives you objective beauty, and that beauty is objective. Wait a second. There's like three moral points that were objectively true. Yeah, rational, beautiful, and good. So there's goodness and there's beauty, which is an objective standard, and there's rational thought.
Yeah, I guess I would agree. I don't think there's a whole lot more to take away. It was, I think, a very interesting cultural artifact from that time, and
Yeah.
it does show that new atheism was based on a kind of unwarranted optimism that hasn't really aged very well. So, yeah, I'll say thanks again, Florian, for coming on. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Presuppositional podcast signing off.